We are live. Hello, everyone. I am Jacob Winograd. I am the host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast here at the Libertarian Christian Institute. You're live with me here in the green room, and my guest for tonight is Dave DeCamp, news editor at antiwar.com, host of the Anti-War News podcast, daily podcast, where he delivers the sort of daily coverage of U.S. foreign policy from, of course, the non-interventionist perspective, and also a fellow Christian. You are a one of the select Catholics that comes onto the show to usually, unfortunately, we don't talk too much about matters of faith, and we'll have to maybe change that sometime and just have you on for a more casual conversation. But I wanted to get you on to talk about, how somehow we keep on doubling down in this bizarro world of foreign policy that is Trump 2.0. But first of all, thanks for being here again, man. How are you doing? I hope you're able to at least find time for peace and respite and spending time with the family these days.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jacob. But yeah, we're certainly very busy at antiwar.com. It's been really crazy. And kind of my feeling this whole time over the past, what is this, the 17th day now, is that I can't actually believe that this is happening. And this war, we'll get into it obviously, but this war, it's going about as bad as it could so far. And it doesn't seem like there's a way out. But yeah, besides that, I'm very lucky and blessed to have the situation I do. I live out in the country with my family and I work from home. So I do get to spend a lot of time with them.
That's good. It's good. I mean, especially when the world is this crazy, it's just all the more important to find our hope in God and spending time with family and not letting all the darkness drive us into dark places ourselves. I do want to, get people caught up, and I have a hard time keeping up with just the daily news and what's going on. I thought a good place to start for today, though, so that anyone who has any level of knowledge of what's going on can kind of jump right in, is to at least connect this back to the 12-Day War, which happened back in June of last year, and what so I want to just kind of recap what happened there, what that was supposed to accomplish, and then how that connects to what we're seeing right now. Because there definitely seems to be at least somewhat of a connection, because this war certainly didn't come out of nowhere. There's been ongoing, escalations and hostilities with Iran really since Trump took office.
Yeah, so the 12-Day War was back in June 2025, which was also started when the US and Iran were engaged in negotiations. And basically, based on what I understand, it was similar to this time, that essentially the plan, war was the plan, and the negotiations were essentially a ruse, and they used them as cover to start the war. And the big difference between that war and this war is that the 12-Day War started with Israeli airstrikes, and Israel was leading the attacks, and the U.S. Was not directly launching airstrikes at first. Of course, Israel is completely reliant on the U.S. when it comes to fighting a war with Iran. The U.S. military was directly involved in the sense that they were shooting down Iranian missiles, both from air defense systems inside Israel, elsewhere in the region, and U.S. warships in the region were involved in that. But it wasn't until, I forget how long, maybe 8 or 9 days into the war, that the U.S. actually launched direct airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, and the B-2 bombers were brought out for that. And according to President Trump, those facilities were totally obliterated, completely destroyed Iran's nuclear program. And then a ceasefire deal was reached after 12 days. But the important thing for people to understand was that war was not a victory for Israel in the sense of what they really wanted to accomplish, because it wasn't about the nuclear program. That was really just the pretext for the war. Israel's goals was to take Iran off the board as a threat to Israel's designs for the region. Yeah, they're really the only actor at this point who's both willing to and able to actually confront Israel, because all the Arab countries are allied with the U.S. and essentially bought off, especially Jordan and Egypt, with all the military aid that they get from the U.S. So when it comes to that, the specific things that Israel wants to accomplish, everybody throws around the word regime change, which is something I'm sure Israel would like to, install a friendly government in Iran, but that's not really the goal. I mean, the goal is regime collapse. They would be perfectly fine if the country, the government collapsed and the country was broken apart. And they were trying to do that in the 12-day war because it started with attacks on leadership. You had Mossad agents calling Iranian officers and threatening their families, saying, make a video saying that you're defecting. But that didn't work. And then the other thing that they hoped to achieve was to take Iran's missiles, take their missile capability out. But that also didn't happen because up until the last minutes of the 12-day war, Iran was hitting Israel with missiles. That's why essentially a ceasefire deal was reached just after 12 days. So that is back in June. And I think that's something a lot of people didn't understand, is that the goals weren't really accomplished. And you had President Trump, going on and saying, "Oh, it was great. We obliterated the nuclear program. Now we can have peace in the Middle East." But then all of a sudden, I guess their nuclear program, magically reconstituted itself, and we just started hearing, this kind of. I don't want to maybe go right to this because there was other things that happened kind of in the lead up to this war. Should I kind of transition to that now?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, and yeah, the lead up for this war, there's been several justifications. They're talking about the nuclear program, which we supposedly eliminated last year. There's of course the, I guess, humanitarian angle, and there were protests in Iran and varying reports of just wildly disproportionate amounts of protesters that were killed in the region. Of course, any number of protesters being killed is of course horrific, but there's just, some reports are in the thousands and some are north of 35,000. So yeah, what is your assessment in terms of just like the varying narratives of why we're going back in now? Are any of them, do they have a little bit of merit to them, or are these all just sort of like, post hoc framing being come up by the politicians and by the regime of both in Israel, and in America? I mean, I also wonder to some extent, I don't know if there's anything to back this up, but I you can work this in wherever you want to. I've been wondering if maybe Trump at this point, just because this is the kind of hubris I think Trump's personality has, and I know this happened with other presidents as well. Like maybe there's some kind of like legacy building thing here too, where like he just wants to be able to say he accomplished something great on like the world stage, and this is he's not going to have another term, so maybe there's something there, or there's angles about resources, or trying to gain dominance over China and Russia and their influence in the region. So yeah, there's a lot there. What's the extent to which the official narratives line up? Are there other reasons that might be at play here? Of course, also we should talk about the degree to which perhaps Israel and its lobby might be dragging Israel into this. I know that's also the view of some people.
Yeah, well, I think I was of the opinion basically that when Trump and Netanyahu met at Mar-a-Lago at the end of December, that's when the decision was made that there was going to be war. And it seemed like the main issue they were talking about there was Iran's ballistic missiles. And Trump was asked, after their meeting, or actually I think it was before their meeting when they were talking to reporters, if Iran continues its missile program, will you support an Israeli attack on Iran? Essentially, the question is, will there be another war? And Trump said yes. That was his answer. And he also said that, if they continue their missiles, yes, and also if they try to rebuild their nuclear program, then absolutely, we're gonna go in again. And this just happened to be the time when the protests started in Iran, when that meeting happened. And according to Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, this is what he said himself: those protests were the result of the U.S. sanctions collapsing Iran's economy. Of course, Iran's economy has been under a whole lot of U.S. sanctions for many years, but this administration specifically targeted its oil sales to Asia and China, and it did look like it was able to put the squeeze on it even more. And there was some serious ramifications, which is what the initial protests were about, the economic situation, and that was at the end of December. And then things started to heat up in Iran. And it's tough to really know exactly what happened. There was definitely, U.S. and Mossad intelligence involved in these protests, but at the same time, there was an organic element to it as well. And there were attacks on Iranian security forces. This has been confirmed both by Iranian government sources and these NGOs that the U.S. funds that put out death tolls that at least a few hundred Iranian police and military personnel were killed. But of course, there was also a crackdown on nonviolent protesters, and thousands of people were killed. We don't know what the real numbers are. Trump goes out and says, 32,000 people were killed, and there's just no basis for that figure. The number that the Iranian government has admitted to is about 3,000, and then one of these NGOs that they're actually putting out numbers now for the civilian death toll in the U.S. and Israeli bombing campaign, and according to them, they verified 7,000 people killed in the protests. So it's probably somewhere between that, but we really don't know. I'm not going to pretend like I know how many people were killed. And then of course everybody remembers during the protests, Trump started really making threats, saying that if they kill protesters, he's going to bomb them, telling them to take over their institutions. And all indications were that about mid-January or early January, Trump was about to bomb Iran. It looked like a U.S. attack was imminent, but then he backed down. And according to the reporting, I mean, essentially the narrative that was put out, which I think is probably correct, is that the person who told him not to do it was Benjamin Netanyahu. And why would Netanyahu tell the U.S. not to attack Iran? It's because he was worried about the Iranian counterattacks, because the U.S. had just deployed a whole bunch of firepower to the Caribbean, and they didn't have as much in the Middle East as they did during the 12-day war. And that is when we started to see the start of this major military buildup. And a lot of people kind of focus on the aircraft carriers and stuff. But one thing, since mid-January, there was just a steady stream of U.S. military cargo aircraft pouring into the Middle East. And what they were bringing in was air defenses, munitions and things like that to really prepare for this war. So I was pretty certain that this war was coming, and that the negotiations were just buying time. And so to get into all the shifting, you see JD Vance go out there and claim that there's evidence that Iran is building a nuclear weapon or trying to build a nuclear weapon. I mean, there's just just a complete lie, whether he's been fed those lies or he's lying on his own. Either way, I mean, he's smart enough to know that wasn't really happening. And Steve Witkoff was saying similar things during the negotiations. That was another sign to me that you have Witkoff just saying things that are just blatantly false in his interviews during the negotiations. I knew he wasn't serious about reaching a diplomatic deal. So this is about Israel's interest in taking out the missiles and either regime change or regime destruction. That's why they killed the Ayatollah. And when it comes to like the U.S. empire's own interests, I think a big part of this, another thing feeding this, is the military budget. I mean, Trump is saying he wants $1.5 trillion for next year. They're using a whole bunch of munitions. I mean, they're spending tens of billions of dollars already on this war. So I think that's a big factor here. Kind of the interests of Israel and the military-industrial complex are align here. And you see a lot of cope among the China hawks who are like, well, this is actually about China. But just because China gets a lot of oil from Iran. But what we're seeing is the U.S. pulling military assets out of the Asia Pacific to put it into the Middle East, the U.S. getting bogged down in another conflict in the Middle East. And I don't think China's upset about this at all. I think it's in their interest to sit back and watch. So the whole thing is just such a mess, and we could get into like what we've seen now in the war and what the situation is today.
Yeah, so it's interesting you point out that, and I don't think I was aware of that, the extent to which you're saying the protests were at least in large part because of their tanking economy, which was a result of what our government was doing in terms of the sanctions, which I feel like that's one of the things that gets missed a lot when you're not when, unfortunately, this is human nature. When a conflict breaks out, people start paying attention more. But in that downtime, if you're not reading every headline, you don't know what's happening, in sort of the, interims periods between these conflicts when they break out. And so, yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Doesn't justify, I guess, what Iran did in terms of the killing of any protesters, but we'll get into more about, this this sort of like I think there's this with all foreign policy discussions, and this applies here to the Middle East with Iran and all that. There's this sort of like humanitarian logic trap. Like even if we were going to get into a debate about the numbers and we were going to uh, almost believe that a large sort of reason why we're doing this is because of the humanitarian reasons of Iran's government killing its own people. Um, and again, we don't know what the actual numbers are. But when we launch a war, then that also seems to be killing civilians. I feel like there's something there that needs to be stated, which I don't know how that can be justified on humanitarian reasons, especially when it feels like we're at this. Well, one, I think it's counterproductive because I think we're starting to see this rally around the flag effect within Iran, where while there were protests, now it seems like the opposite is happening, and everyone's kind of rallying behind the nation and the government against what America and Israel are doing. The other thing seems to be that this I've seen reports at least that there's concerns that they're not going to be able to keep up their operations as they stand now because I guess they're running out of like anti-ballistic missiles or anti-missile missiles, and so for them to be able to protect themselves, protect their bases, protect for Israel to be able to protect themselves at the rate that they're going, it's going to get harder and harder, and they've already uh, also expressed that their ability to stop Iranian missiles was harder than they initially anticipated. And for everything we've done, both last year and this year, it's not been enough to topple the regime. And so, if like the war is going to be sold on this regime is evil and killing civilians, and then we launch a war against them, which kills civilians and doesn't overthrow the regime, then the only ways out of that, and maybe you can tell me if I'm right or wrong on this, seems to be that either we just hit a point where we stop, and now just we've killed a bunch of people and destroyed a bunch of infrastructure, and we've inflamed tensions in the region between Israel and Iran and us, and that's not good for long-term peace or humanitarian concerns. Or and I don't say this because I want this to happen. The only other option, if you were going to double down on the humanitarian justification, would be you'd have to escalate and now put boots on the ground to actually be like, well, we have to actually commit to some kind of long-term invasion and regime change to just completely uproot their government. Uh, which at that point, then we're talking about even more civilian deaths. And we already had, of course, the I've not seen good numbers to know how many civilian deaths there are from the Israeli and U.S. strikes, but there's at least several hundred, including the school that was likely hit by the United States, because there's been no evidence to back up the idea that it was Iran that did it. I know Trump was trying to go on this whole thing that anyone can get a Tomahawk missile and launch it, but I mean, and I think, am I not correct in thinking that the entire area around that school was hit by the U.S.? So it's kind of like, yeah, we hit all this, but then this one building here we didn't. It just doesn't make sense. So what do you make of that in terms of, what are, I mean, if you have any information on what the civilian death total is so far in Iran, as well as for Israel, that would be nice to know. But also like, you know, is there this danger of like, they're going to look really stupid if they walk away and they've gotten nothing out of this, and could that potentially lead to Trump being more amenable to like escalating rather than walking away with egg on his face?
Yeah, when it comes to the numbers, so according to this human rights group that is based in the US but has networks in Iran, they're the ones who, put out numbers about the protester deaths that they say they confirm 7,000. According to them, over 1,300 civilians have been killed so far in the US and Israeli strikes, and that's about the numbers that the Iranian government has put out as well. They both said a little over 200 children have been killed, and the majority were in that school massacre, as you mentioned, which was like in the first hours of the war, one of the first strikes. Yeah, and all the evidence shows there's been a Pentagon investigation that they're not admitting it publicly, but according to a lot of reporting, that all evidence points to it being a U.S. strike. and it being a building that they bombed because they were using outdated intelligence. It was a school near an IRGC base, and the building that the school was in used to be part of the base, but somewhere around 2014, I think it was separated and turned into a school. And so, and it was, I mean, 168 people were killed, the majority being little schoolgirls and schoolboys between the age of 7 and 12. I mean, so just one of the most horrific uh, massacres of civilians in a U.S. war that I could think of in recent decades. Um, so, yeah, it's been very, very horrible for the civilians in Iran, and there's been all sorts of interviews and things with people who supported the protests and the idea of the U.S. imposing regime change in their country, who are devastated by the fact that their neighborhoods are now being bombed. Um, you remember, it's the U.S. and Israel bombing them,
Right.
and so, we don't know. We know the school was the U.S. I mean, I think everybody's initial reaction was that they suspected Israel, but it turns out it was the U.S. military. When it comes to what Trump's going to do next, I mean, all signs are pointing toward escalation. Everything is pointing toward this thing just dragging on. The one thing you hear from some Trump people, David Sachs was saying this the other day, and he is technically a member of the administration, as like the AI and cryptos are, whatever that means. He's saying, oh, Trump should just declare victory and call it a day. They decimated the military. And Josh Hawley said something similar. The problem is that I don't think Iran would accept that at the moment. I mean, Iran's message has been, we don't want a ceasefire. We want guarantees that this isn't going to happen again. From their viewpoint, if there's a ceasefire, they're just going to be attacked again by the U.S. and Israel in 6 months. And if they see that, and there's been reports, we don't know, there's a lot of information war going on, that the U.S. has reached out about a potential ceasefire and that Iran said no. But don't know if that's exactly true. But that is the message that Iran's putting out there, is that they don't even want a ceasefire at the moment. And yeah, Americans kind of focus on the destruction. Yeah, we've killed a lot more Iranians that, certainly have destroyed a lot of their military. But look at a map, man. I mean, Iran is a huge country, and their whole deterrence is based on the ability to fire missiles and drones. And they have plenty of mountains where they could do that from. So, there's just no sign that their missiles or drones have been depleted enough that they're not going to be able to keep up, their attacks across the region. I'm sure they're producing, because they're a country at war. So they're probably, they're, wherever their production of drones and things is, they're probably just ramping all of that up as much as they possibly can. And their drones, according to the Pentagon, the thing that they've had the most trouble intercepting is the drones, and they're cheap to make. They don't need launchers to fire. And I'm sure they have that whole assembly process streamlined. And so they can just crank them out. And so, yeah, you mentioned, potential boots on the ground, and it does appear that that is seriously being considered, not like a full scale invasion, but sending in special operations teams potentially to secure Karg Island, which is a small island in the Persian Gulf off the coast of Iran, where most of Iran's oil exports go through. But it's right on the coast. I mean, that would be very difficult to seize and hold. And then also they're talking about bombing, taking over other parts of Iran's coastline. And this is just recipe for disaster, for escalation. I mean, you saw that, you have a new supreme leader now, who is basically a younger version, literally I mean, he's the guy's son, the younger version of the old Ayatollah, who was killed. And also his mother and wife and son have also been killed. There was, I saw some videos from Iran the other day. People were out for a march on Friday. And so far, the new Ayatollah, the new supreme leader, has not made any public appearances. There's reports that he may have been wounded, but he's put out statements and things. But of the Iranian foreign minister, the head of their security council, other officials on the streets walking around with people. And there was another video of, an airstrike hit nearby during some pro-government rally. And you see the people start cheering and chanting when the airstrikes are hitting. I mean, so they've really, they're really radicalizing people in Iran. And I'm sure members of the Iranian military who have had family killed or, are ready to fight if U.S. troops enter the country. And that's what the foreign minister, I mean, Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, who the face of of diplomacy, who for months, for years now, has been saying that, there's a deal to be had with the U.S. Let's do business together. He was on, I forget what news network interviewed him, but he said, "Are you guys worried about a U.S. invasion?" And he said, "No, we're waiting for them. We're ready for them.
Right.
Bring
Yeah.
them
I
basically
saw
because
that.
we know it'll be a disaster for them."
Yeah. I mean, I was just talking to my brother about this today, who is sort of like libertarian leaning, but not quite a, committed non-interventionist. But I was just making the point to him. I was like, we had in Afghanistan, I think total across all the years, something around like 700, 800,000 troops. At the height around 2011, I think it was over 115, 120,000. I forget the numbers for Iraq, but, again, very high numbers. And we could barely, accomplish in these tiny countries doing regime change and fighting off insurgents, and we, basically failed, especially in Afghanistan. So it's like, what's the idea of like what we're going to do in Iran, which is way bigger, way more strategically positioned, way more equipped. It's like, if this turns into a long-term conflict, how much more disastrous is it going to be? And, there's, I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but I think I saw something even about how they recently, and I guess it was in the, whether it was the big beautiful bill or another bill that passed, that they changed the sign up for selective service to be like automated or something. So again, it's one of those things where you're like, are they gearing up for like they're going to actually invoke congressional authority and war powers, and we're going to, you know have more of a concentrated effort? I don't know. I don't want to jump there, but it's something that, I think is reasonable to be concerned about. I also think that, to use that school bombing as a framing again, I hear this point a lot, that whether you're talking about this war, or we heard this a lot when Israel was more active in engaging with Gaza and Hamas, that, well, we just have to accept, Dave, that there are these complications of modern urban warfare, and innocent people get killed and there's collateral damage and it's unavoidable. But it's worse because the Muslim countries that are, in question here, intentionally put their troops or their military equipment, their leaders in civilian areas to create this sort of moral hazard. That's where you get the human shield idea. But one, even if we're going to grant to some extent that that's true, it's predictable and foreseeable. And so you need to think about that when you're deciding to declare a war, right? To be like, we need to have a plan for how we're going to mitigate against civilian casualties, make sure we don't kill civilians, especially if you're going to invoke, as this administration does. I mean, they have a whole faith office, right? And they're praying over Trump. So they're like, we're Christians doing this, right? They're trying to, kind of paint this administration as this sort of like resurgence and like a uh of Christians leading the nation in some way. And then they're doing this, and it's just like, I mean, I'm currently writing a book on the Christian tradition of just war, which clearly states not only things about like just cause and making sure that you have a plan for peace and you've exhausted all options for peace, but also that you have to make really strong distinctions between enemy and non enemy combatants and non-combatants. But also, like, and I'm sure you're aware of this, it's kind of true even in our own country and really across the world, that there's all sorts of examples of military and civilian areas kind of being in very complicated vicinities with each other, especially in urban areas. So at what point is this talking point about human shields and urban warfare just an excuse? Just to be like, urban warfare is complicated, therefore, it doesn't matter if hundreds or thousands of innocent people die. It's just like, it's unavoidable. I feel like even from where you and I are sitting, like we would judge at least differently if like we actually saw a military and a government that like was really good across the board at avoiding civilian casualties, and then like there's a mistake. And we would still say the mistake was bad, but it's different when it's like, oh wow, in a 12-month period, two mistakes were made. And then there's between saying like, well, just every time we strike someone, innocent people die. That's just the cost of doing business, right? I mean, I don't know how, like, what's broken in people's moral compass and calculus, especially people who proclaim to be Christians, that they just kind of accept it.
Well, I think a big thing is that it's far away, for Americans who support this stuff is that, they just can't really comprehend, I don't think, what it's actually like for people there on the ground. But I mean, when it comes to the school strike, I mean, there's no even excuse like that. It was if the story is true that we're hearing that it was just sheer incompetence is the reason why all of those children were killed, and not just incompetence, but neglect and also malice on the part of Pete Hegseth and his War Department, because they specifically, came in and there were mechanisms set up to avoid civilian casualties and things, and they gutted all that and loosened the rules of engagement. And then you see Hegseth go out there and give his press conferences, and he says, "Oh, there's no more stupid rules of engagement. This isn't a politically correct war.
Right.
We're
And you're
we're
referring to where they cut the defense in the Defense Department, they cut the funding that was specifically allocated for the analysis for civilian casualty prevention. So it's
yeah,
like on one hand, it's like we're Christians waging just war. On the other hand, they're like, we're not even trying. It's like yeah, there's like these weird conflicting narratives where on one hand, I think it's more like the propagandists out there, like the people actually trying to sell the war, and like the Republican media class are trying to almost make this kind of spin. But then like they're telling you that the government, the Trump administration is sometimes just like, saying the quiet part out loud and saying, well, we don't actually care.
yeah. And what Hegseth is saying also, he says that there no mercy. We're operating without mercy.
Right.
And this is, he's saying all this as it was clear that the US bombed this school. And he's asked about it and he says, "Oh, we're investigating." Not once does he say, "Oh, it was a terrible tragedy," or he didn't offer anything like that. I mean, this is really sick stuff, really evil stuff that this administration is doing, and doing it in the name of God. Like, it makes it that much worse. This idea, they're not trying to pretend like this is they're following just war theory as taught by the Catholic Church. I mean, JD Vance is a Catholic, but he's just up there with them and just repeating these lies and justifying everything. So yeah, I think it's just very evil what's being done here.
No,
And President Trump, the way he talks, I mean, I just saw him today talking about Cuba. He's like, "Oh, I think we could get that one next. I think I'm going to get it. I'm going to be able to get Cuba," like whatever that means. I saw this coming because after the Venezuela intervention, which from an American perspective, it was pretty flawless. Like, there's no American casualties. Well, there were casualties. There were troops injured, but none were killed. About, I believe, at least 86 people, including 4 civilians, were killed. They did bomb Caracas pretty heavily, but they got in, they got out, and people lined up to support it. And Trump did this interview with the New York Times afterwards, where he said that they said, "Do you care about international law? What's your authority?" And he said, "Oh, my own morals. Me, I'm the authority." And that attitude, I mean, that's just a recipe for leading yourself into disaster, having that hubris. Because what's implied there is God's not his authority. Trump is his own authority, his own
Yeah.
God. I mean,
Didn't he
and
talk
that's the
about
way he's been
bombing?
operating.
Didn't he talk about just like wanting to bomb Carg Island again just for fun?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, he said
I
for
mean,
fun.
I mean, it's just, again, it's like things that like when you read them, and I'm someone who is pretty sober minded to the reality of the fact that we're ruled over by a an elite class of people who are generally corrupt and evil, and I'm a libertarian ANCAP. But even then it's just like, I think I was talking to you a bit about this pre-show. It's like, at least with like when Biden is in office, and when it was Obama, when it was Bush, it's just like, I don't know if I'm saying this is a good thing, but there's at least this sort of like, they're going to pretend like they're not the moral monsters that they are.
Yeah.
Whereas with Trump and this current administration, it's just like, really? They said that? Like they just like, there's no pretense anymore. That's just, I guess that's what happens when you go from calling it the Department of Defense to the Department of War, is like, no new wars turned into yes, new wars very, very quickly. The other thing that I've been reading about is that as I'm always trying to learn more about, foreign policy and the way our government operates. And I don't know if what you can say to this, but I guess maybe Israel does this too, because I think I've heard this more in conjunction to Israel. But they are often even, I think, classifying combatants in a way that's really not honest, because they'll do a drone strike and basically say that any military age male in a strike zone, uh, they just consider a combatant automatically. Which, especially when you're talking about, urban warfare, where it gets a little bit dicey, where the lines between military and civilian and government stuff butt up. That's not, you can't just go, oh, that kid looks like he's 17 or 18. He's probably a combatant. I mean, again, it's all these things that I just don't understand how people, like, they're either ignorant to it, or I guess they're just really possessed by some sort of like political tribalism that, we're this weird, I guess we have our own, war fever going on the right now. That's just kind of, you know, justifying this, or some kind of like anti, and I mean, I'm a Christian, not a Muslim, but I do think some of it is also motivated by this, uh, definitely like this like fear mongering anti-Muslim kind of sentiment that runs through a lot of uh, right wing circles.
Yeah, and another thing that I think is, the way that both the U.S. and Israel operate in these wars is that, they classify all these groups as terrorists, and if you're a terrorist, that doesn't just mean we can kill you wherever you are, whether or not you're on a battlefield or any threat to us. That also means we can kill you and your entire family. Um, and then, of course, the other impact of that is other families that are near them that have nothing to do with the war or whatever's happening. So we see these massive attacks, and of course in Gaza, where they just level entire apartment buildings full of women and children. But we saw the U.S. do this in Yemen last year when Trump started that bombing campaign against the Houthis. This was, the new regime was in power. They loosened all the rules of engagement to unleash the military. And in that war, we saw the same type of thing. That was that leaked signal chat. You remember the
Yeah.
controversy was over the fact that they included a Atlantic reporter in there, which obviously was very stupid. But to me, the controversy was what I think it was Mike Waltz said in that chat was, oh, we just took out the Houthis' top missile guy as he walked into, after he went into his girlfriend's apartment. And the implication there is, oh, we leveled it, and he said the building was leveled. Oh, so they leveled the residential building. And that's where we saw all the emojis. JD Vance says, great job, everybody. And it turned out Air Wars confirmed that strike killed at least 13 people, including, I forget the numbers, but several women, families, women and children. And that's the attitude. And that's what we see in Lebanon right now. We see a whole bunch of civilians being killed there. And that's something that's getting a little attention. But also in that bombing campaign in Yemen. And that's why I expected, heavy civilian casualties in this war, because one night in April 2025, they bombed a fuel port in Yemen, in Hodeidah, and killed 84 civilians. And it was mostly people who worked at the port. And the statement that the U.S. Central Command put out was basically, we're targeting the fuel infrastructure, claiming that the Houthis profit from it, which the Houthis are the government in that area. So you could say that for any government, they'll profit on fuel coming into their ports. But that was the justification. They didn't even have a military justification. They killed all these civilians, and it got basically no media coverage in the U.S. And yeah, so we saw a lot of strikes like that in Yemen. And it is just a complete, like, it's a, you think about that, like our government just massacred 84 fuel, port workers, and apparently some rescue workers who showed up and were, they launched another airstrike and killed them. Like, if something like that happened here, it would be such a big story. We'd probably still be talking about it. And it just goes on, and Americans barely notice. But then they get whipped up, when another war starts, they get whipped up and figure out a way to support it.
Yeah, I think there's something, I think like I've heard Dave Smith describe it this way, that like some right wingers are just like, they're like little children playing with action figures when it comes to war. And that whole signal chat controversy also kind of plays into that. I think there's something, again, kind of unbelievable about that story, in the sense of that even from my own sort of jaded, again, anarchist Christian perspective, where I kind of, expect things to be the worst case scenario, I still, I think, almost had this romanticized idea that I think most people have, where they think, well, probably the way that our government works is that before they would carry out some kind of major operation, like they'd probably have some big official meeting and private vote and, long deliberations, and not just this kind of casual be like, walking in like over their phones and signal chats, just be like, oh, by the way, we just killed this guy, leveled the building. I mean, there's just something like, again, it just sounds absurd that the highest pillars of government in the largest, superpower or empire, whatever you want to call it, in the world, that this is how business is conducted. I also wanted to ask you about this. So I've heard from people really close to me that are, sympathetic in principle to the libertarian non-interventionist position, but they still, because they like the idea of like global free trade, and they also, I think, partly because like we grew up hearing about, the Nazis in World War II, and we just think like, well, shouldn't there be some kind of like, we should do something if there's some kind of evil regime in the world. And so they want something like a ill-defined, like, global system of like checks and balances on government around the world that help to secure free trade and, push back against governments that are trying to sort of abuse power against their own civilians, or maybe trying to expand territory or whatnot. And I respond to that. I want to get you to respond to it too, but I respond to it by kind of saying, well, yeah, I want that, but I think that's not what we have. It's nothing close to it. What we have is this like American dominated order that uses economic coercion and sanctions, weaponizing the dollar, and of course military force to sort of centrally plan, and or at least try to centrally plan and control and manage the global economy, but not in a way that serves human flourishing or justice. But it's all, I think, if you just pay attention, it's all our own interest. It's in, not by our own interests. It's not my interests. It's not your interest. It's the interests of those at the top. It's imperial interests, or the military industrial complex's interests. Big mega corporation interests, but not, you know, uh, that's not what I want. I want something where closer to what the founders described, right? Commerce with all, entangling alliances with none. And I don't want sanctions that starve civilian populations and destabilize, governments. But I think a system of free trade where you have natural incentive structures that create this sort of mutual economic interest and dependency, and that's way more productive towards creating durable peace and prosperity. Historically, I mean, that's saying that where goods and people don't freely travel across borders, tanks and armies will. I guess today just add drones and missiles to that. Um, so like when people say, though, we need this like mechanism to police bad actors globally, I also want to say this: who's policing us? Like, who's policing the American government for every, like, I'll grant Iran's done some evil stuff, I'll grant Hamas is a problem. I'll grant Russia shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. But it's like, so what, America's the police that rights all these wrongs? Who's in charge of righting all the wrongs of the American government and everything we do, right? Like, if it is us, if it, or I don't want to say us, if it is the American government, even if it was negligence that destroyed this school, are we going to face any consequences for that? Like, and who's going to enforce it? Like, I just feel these are questions that people, they don't ask, because they say they want bad governments and bad countries to be punished, but what they mean is that only goes one way, right? Accountability only goes one way, and it's the American empire telling everyone else what to do.
Yeah, and I mean, what I always say to things like that is the human rights things, become issues in certain countries, when it's part of an agenda. I mean, you look at this war right now in the Middle East, where all these U.S. bases are, and these Gulf Arab countries, like these are some kind of like bastions for freedom and human rights. If there was protests like that happened in Iran, in any of these countries, we would have seen it, equally as bloody, if not worse, crackdown.
Saudi
I
Arabia is not a global not part of the global liberal order.
Yeah, well, according to Joe Biden, they are. I remember during the Biden administration, that was their thing. That was it's funny, like the contrast between them. Like Tony Blinken and all them, their whole thing was that, oh, we're upholding the rules-based order. And Biden gave a speech to the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, all the Sunni monarchs, and he was using that language. He's like, "Oh, we're here to uphold the rules based order. It's a battle of democracy versus autocracy." That was another one of their lines. It's like, dude, you're talking to a bunch of like Sunni monarchs, and that's you're still going to use that language. So with them, it was just such blatant hypocrisy, especially once October 7th happened, and they just helped Israel completely destroy Gaza and all the horrible atrocities that they were committing. And just in Syria, the U.S. helped bring an Al Qaeda commander to power, and his guys have been committing horrific atrocities, massacres of unarmed civilians, executions. Nobody hears about that. You just don't hear about it because it's not the thing that they want attention on right now. You hear much more about Iran. And why is that? Because Ahmed al-Shara, the former al-Qaeda commander, who was welcomed in the Oval Office, because he's ready to play ball, and he is against Iran, and he opposes, the U.S. wanted to take out an ally of Iran in Syria so they could cut off the weapons pipeline from Iran to Hezbollah to benefit Israel. That's essentially why they supported all that. And now, it doesn't matter if his guys are still, massacring people and everything. So there's just so much hypocrisy here when it comes to all that, the human rights stuff.
Yeah, agreed. What's going on with the wanted to ask you about the Strait of how do you Hormuz? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's going on with that? I've seen so I think they've said that they would allow any ship to pass that's not an American allied ship. How important of this is a not just as a, I guess, strategic asset in terms of the war, but also like how important is this strait in terms of just like the global economy? How much is this impacting oil prices? How, how much of this is evidence that, again, like we've kind of been building the case here, that this military operation was done without a lot of foresight involved? I know I've even seen some speculate that the end result of this would not even be America or Iran having more control, but that it might become something that even China might gain more control over. So I don't know. I've seen a lot of different speculations and debates around the importance of this strait and uh, what it means for both, again, global economy purposes, resource purposes, and strategic military ones, both for the conflict and the broader stage. So what's going on there? What kind of analysis or insight can you give us?
Yeah, I mean, the Strait of Hormuz being closed is a big deal. It's something I know in 2025, 30% of the world's oil, the seaborne oil, was shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. Um, Many of the U.S.'s allies in Asia, not just China, are very reliant on oil that comes from, they're getting it from the Gulf countries. China does get a lot of oil from Iran. I was reading Japan, it's something like 90% of their oil comes from the Gulf. Uh, so it's a big deal. And you see it with the oil prices. They've been kind of hovering around $100 per barrel lately. Iran is saying it's going to go up to 200. And Chris Wright, the U.S. Energy Secretary, was asked about this the other day, and he did not. He just kind of tried to deflect and not answer the question. But he would not say, no, we're not going to see $200 a barrel. And of course, that's going to, the U.S. is a major producer of oil now, but oil is a global market. So when the price goes up, the gas prices go up here in the U.S. And that's the one way that people vote. I mean, people that don't pay attention to politics, if they see gas prices going up, then they want to vote whoever is in office out. So that's kind of a whole nother dynamic, like the political situation. But when it comes to this strait, I mean, Iran is controlling it now. They've closed it. They've allowed a few, very small number of ships to go through. I know some of them have been carrying Iranian oil to China. They've been actually, there was 1 week. I don't know if they've kept up this rate, but there was 1 week in March where they exported more oil. Iran exported more oil than they were before the war, at a rate higher than before the war. So now that's a result of this war, is that Iran is controlling the strait. And why are they able to do that? It's because it's right on their coast. And people think in kind of an old mindset when it comes to military assets and stuff. Like, they think Iran would need to mine the strait to close it, and then that would mean, no ships can go through, not even Iranian oil shipments or anything. But that's not what they don't need to do that. They just, fly drones into tankers that try to go through and blow them up. And they've done that to at least 10 tankers, I believe. So people aren't going through now. And they don't need their super long range advanced ballistic missiles to hit a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. They're very much in control of it at the moment. And Trump, you could see, is really kind of flailing about this and panicking. It seems like, based on all of his long posts on Truth Social about it. Now he asked China to come help him, saying China should send ships to open it up. But Iran says China is free to go through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is a huge problem. And this is something Iran is going to, I believe, keep in effect even if Trump tries to declare a ceasefire. And it's one reason why I think this thing's going to escalate, because Trump's going to try to take some measure to try to open this thing up. And I think that could involve trying to take over the coast or something of Iran. So it's a really big problem for Trump.
Yeah. I wanted to also ask about what's going on with the order or recommendation. I don't know which one it was, but for I guess U.S. citizens in Iraq to evacuate. And of course, I feel like this touches on just the broader history of the region, and just how many of the people. A bit of a sidebar, but it's related. Like, how many of the people? I'm sure. Listen, probably Vance, probably some of the top people making these decisions. You would hope that they understand the facts on the ground about the makeup of the different of Iran, of Iraq, surrounding regions. What proportion is Sunni? What proportion is Shia? Of course, we know from Iraq War II that they don't always make these considerations very well, because they fought the war in Iraq and empowered the sort of Shia majority there to actually be an asset for Iran. So those are kind of facts on the ground that I feel like we can expound on a little bit here as we have time, but it's sort of like there's just so many people who are just having a conversation about foreign policy in the Middle East, and it's like they haven't even spent enough time studying the just the different factions at play here, and like not just broadly speaking, but within each nation and sort of the history. Because it's like if you spend an hour looking in that, you realize just how complicated it is, which is just another reason why we shouldn't be there in the first place. But what's the risk here in terms of for Iraq and people there? How might certain groups in Iraq be reacting to what's going on with Iran, and how could that potentially hurt what America and Israel are trying to accomplish?
Yeah, well, it appears that a lot of the Shiite militias in Iraq have entered the war and have been attacking U.S. bases. They've been claiming drone attacks on U.S. bases. I know some American troops were recently injured. A French soldier was killed. This is where the KC-135 refueling tanker crashed, which killed 6 U.S. troops. The military claims it had nothing to do with enemy fire or anything, but I'm sure it had something to do with what was going on there. Um, and this is obviously very easily predictable that they were going to get involved. And we saw the U.S. kind of move some assets around Iraq and Syria before the war started. And, they were withdrawing from major bases in Syria and in Iraq. And I think that was part of the repositioning, because they were preparing for this to some extent. But so you have, as you mentioned, there's all different factions in Iraq, but there's a group called the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is a coalition of Shia militias that formed in 2014 to fight ISIS. And they were actually, on the same side as the U.S. when they destroyed the ISIS caliphate in Iraq and Syria. And these groups vary. They're mostly Shiite militias. Some of them are more allied and aligned with Iran than others. And there's kind of an offshoot of this group that calls itself the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. And if you remember, after October 7th, there was a whole bunch of drone attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. And it was this group that was claiming them. And they ended up killing 3 Americans in Jordan. And this is back in early 2024. And then the U.S. bombed the crap out of them, and they essentially stopped after that. But now their attacks, they're back in the fight. And I know, and there's been heavy U.S. airstrikes, possibly Israeli airstrikes in Iraq as well. They've killed dozens of PMF guys. So it's a mess. I mean, it seems to be escalating there as well. And this is another thing about why the risk of escalation. I mean, this war is across the region already. It's expanded. There's all sorts of different actors at play here now. The Shiite militias are allied with Iran, but they also have their own interests, and they want the U.S. out. And this is something they've been trying to do for a while. So even if, say, Iran says, all right, maybe we want to wind things down, they might say no and see this as their opportunity to try to get the U.S. out if the U.S. is on its back foot in the country. And it's turning other, the Iraqi government, which is, we back their military. They're not happy with that the U.S. is bombing this one part of their military. I mean, and, there's, people chanting death to America in the Iraqi parliament. So there's the chance of the Iraqi state, like the official state, also kind of turning on the U.S. here. Just more escalation is probably in play in Iraq.
Yeah, I know also, I don't know how serious this was a suggestion, but, another faction that was heavily involved in the Iraq saga and fighting ISIS were the Kurds. I know that's something that Netanyahu brought up was, maybe we need to bring the Kurds back in, which, again, kind of a sidebar, but I just wonder, like, are the Kurds even willing to help us again? Because, I mean, how many times can they help us get a bunch of their people slaughtered and have us give them nothing for it until they stop being willing to help American foreign policy interests?
Yeah, well, it doesn't seem like they're that into this idea. And I think there was kind of a psyop going on. If you remember, like a week or two ago, there was all of a sudden, like all the major media outlets reported that a Kurdish offensive against Iran has started. But it turned out it wasn't true. There was no Kurdish offensive. And there's different factions among the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan, which borders Iran. But as far as I could tell, the main ones and the leadership, the government in Iraqi Kurdistan, they don't want anything to do with it because of those, the history you mentioned there.
Right.
And on the other hand, you had some of them were involved in claiming attacks on Iranian security forces during the protests back in January. So there was actually fighting between Kurds and Iraq and Iranian forces during those protests. But it doesn't seem like, as far as I can tell, that has started up again. So, I don't think the Kurds are on board, at least at the moment. And I mean, there was just another betrayal of the Kurds that just happened. The Syrian government, which again is now led by this Al-Qaeda guy, they just went on the offensive in the northeast of Syria against the U.S.-backed Kurds there and took territory and were like letting ISIS guys out of prison and stuff. And the U.S. basically said, all right, you're on your own. And even Tom Barrack, who's Trump's envoy to Turkey, but he's also been involved with Syria stuff, he put out this whole statement saying that the new Syrian government is they're the better ally now against ISIS, even though, remember, their military is riddled with ISIS guys. And that was put on display by an attack back in December when 3 Americans were killed. 2 National Guardsmen and a civilian interpreter were killed by a member of Syria's internal security forces. So anyway, that's kind of a whole tangent there, but it just goes to show the mess getting involved in backing these groups on the ground and backing this one against that one. And it's like, we're really going to try to do this again now in Iran, back the Kurds on the ground. There's other militants in southeastern Iran that are potentially on the table for the U.S. supporting them. And of course, it would be a total disaster, a total mess if this does go down. But I think that was the hope for a minute there, that the Kurds would launch an offensive with U.S. air support, but it doesn't seem like that's happening.
Oh, I want to zoom out a little bit here. I mean, because again, I mean, kudos to what you guys are doing, and I think I read antiwar.com at least every other day, several times a week. I try to read it every day if I can. There's just so much happening in the world, and there's also just so much happening in the Middle East that I feel like I'm more informed than maybe the average American, and yet I feel like I only know a fraction of like what guys like you and Kyle and Scott know. But it's just at some point when you start paying attention to these things, which I guess maybe that's the answer is not enough people do. But it's sort of like, okay, I believe we've been meddling in the Middle East since 1953. But if we just want to talk about like maybe more modern interventions, it's like we've been especially intervening since 2001. I know we were doing things in Iraq in the 90s as well, but we've definitely picked up since 2011. It gave the neocons their kind of green light to to actually do all the things they talked about in their plans, like in the clean break memo, what they talked about uh, in their articles and stuff and writings for PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. So we've been running this experiment now for over 2 decades of interventions. We've done Afghanistan, we've done Iraq. We've now been messing in Iran. We've of course have interventions in Syria. We've had interventions. I think Sudan, Somalia, all this stuff, all these interventions in the broader Middle Eastern Muslim world. That region does not seem to be getting closer to liberty. Doesn't seem to be getting closer to, like not fighting each other, not fighting us. I mean, what's the end game here? Like, do they even have an end game? Because it's like, or is it literally just we don't we don't care about the end game. It's just sort of a sort of in the moment ad hoc, just sort of like acting on uh financial and imperial incentives and just making it up as they go. I feel like, the neocons at least had this like vision of like they thought they could just go in and take all these countries out and like secure the realm. I don't know what the Trump administration is doing. I don't even know what the Biden administration was doing. It just it feels like there's all this language about uh we talked about the humanitarian reasons. Some people think it's about uh like fighting back against these regimes because they're Muslim and they're a threat to the Western world. But it's like if you really think they're that much of a threat, then I mean, like, are they all? I mean, I don't even know how to entertain that thought as a thought experiment because it's just not true, and it also collapses all Muslims into like one collective Borg unit when it's like beyond just the Sunni Shia division. There's a bunch of subdivisions within Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. So again, I guess the better question here is like, what is sort of the end game here, and do people like the American people think that this is actually going somewhere positive, that there's some kind of benefit for us, some kind of benefit for them? Like, I just don't I I don't know how to even, uh, at this point when we've run the experiment for this long, I mean, it's kind of like 6 weeks flatten the curve with COVID. It's like, do we need 20 more years in the Middle East, and then we'll finally have peace? I just I don't get it.
Well, I think with this current administration, some of them, especially Jared Kushner, who's very involved, even though he's not like officially in the administration, they have this vision basically. And I think this is what they're trying to enact is that they take out Iran, um, and then they advance, the Abraham Accords more and broker more normalization deals between Israel and the Arab countries. Um, but that whole strategy does not deal with the fundamental underlying problem of why there's conflict in the region, and that is the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory and Israeli expansion, which we're seeing now, expansion into Lebanon, into Syria. So they kind of just don't want to address that because they're supportive of it, and they just want to force these normalization deals that don't really do anything. They call them peace deals, but there was no war between Israel and Bahrain. There was no war between Israel and the UAE. So obviously, I do think that that's what they want to do. I remember in 2024 when Israel escalated in Lebanon and they took out Nasrallah, they did the pager attack. They put a pretty hard hit onto how this is the moment for them to completely annihilate Hezbollah, and the U.S. should not hold them back. They should support them in doing it. So I think that's his thinking, and that's part of Netanyahu's thinking. And they're like, I mean, they have serious connections. What did Netanyahu slept in Jared Kushner's childhood bedroom? He was friends with his family, and they have been in touch, just about every day, according to reporting, during the negotiations. So they're very much on the same page, I think, and that's what they're trying to sell to Trump is, the Abraham Accords. We just got to get rid of Iran, and then peace is going to break out. Well, that's not working out well, especially because this potentially will take all these Gulf Arab countries out of, they might however this ends. I don't know how it's going to end, but it could end with them wanting the U.S. bases out of their country. I bet a lot of them are thinking that now, because the U.S. military presence was supposed to be about protection and keep them safe, and now it's getting them, attacked by missiles and drones. But I think that's part of like what their grand picture is, and also Trump himself seems to be very doubling down on kind of the American empire, and after the 12-day war, bombing the nuclear facilities, and after Venezuela, he thinks, I can just do these things. I can just rearrange the world how we want it. But obviously, that type of hubris was going to blow up in his face, and it seems like it's really blowing up in his face in a big way. So when it comes to this administration, I think that's they had all these plans and national security strategies about focusing on the Western Hemisphere and as part of the competition with China. But that, now because they doubled down on support for Israel and Zionism, that's kind of all blowing up as well, because now all the resources are going to be going to the Middle East. So yeah, like what is their end game now? I guess they're just hoping that they could destroy Iran and win this somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes no sense. Just living in fantasy land. I mean, the whole the other thing you brought up, one of the primary drivers of this is Israel and their occupation of Gaza. I mean, I feel like, again, one of the things that isn't talked about enough is that people will automatically assume that because, like, let's say Hamas and Hezbollah are terrorist groups and they're Muslim, that there's this like connection or association, like, oh, we were attacked by terrorist Muslims on 9/11, so like these are the same thing. But they're like so fun, and this, they're not the same thing. Like Bin Laden was a Sunni. He was a what was it, a Salafi Sunni Muslim, and that is the type of Islam that is more associated with this kind of like global jihadist type of terrorism. And they of course had their own grievances with American foreign policy that drove a lot of that.
Well, yeah,
And
that's
political
why
swings.
Netanyahu said 9/11 was good in his like initial comments on it. There's a New
Right.
York Times report, I think it was like from right after, and he said, "Oh, it's good," and he like corrected himself. He said, I mean, now Americans understand, what we're dealing with."
Right.
um,
But it's different because, like, Hezbollah, Hamas, these are, and I guess they are to some extent, proxies of Iran, but they're not motivated by that same kind of Islam that Bin Laden was. They're these are all different Shiite Islam groups, to my understanding, and
Hamas is Sunni,
Hamas is Sunni. Okay, um,
and that's
it's
why they kind of had a falling out with Iran during the war in Syria, because they were pro regime change. They were on the side of the moderate rebels, and Iran wasn't. But then they, I think, reconciled. But yeah, there was a little while there where
but they're not.
they're very much at odds with each other, Hamas and Iran.
So they're not completely the proxy of Iran that the
No,
media makes them out to be.
no, not like Hezbollah.
Yeah, but it's still like their grievances seem much more motivated by what's going on. I mean, not that they're fans of America, but they seem much more regionally motivated by what's going on with Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, I know like the Houthis, another group I think that fits that description. Like they um have pretty much, to my knowledge, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but like I think most of the times that they've been kind of attacking America or Israel or like blocking a lot of ships and whatnot have been more of a response because of what's going on in Israel than Like the I don't think most of these groups, not in the same way Bin Laden was at least, they're not motivated by this like we need to create this giant global Islamic terror um force to go and combat the West and destroy them. I think they're much more motivated by. I mean, they definitely don't want America in the Middle East and mucking about, and they I think a lot of these groups, at least their stated positions, whether or not you want to believe them or not, I guess, but I think their stated positions are that uh, they would be more willing to recognize Israel or stop attacking Israel if they just let the Palestinians go.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, all these groups are a product of, their environment. I mean, Hezbollah was formed essentially in response to the Israeli invasion and things of Lebanon, and Hamas obviously didn't exist until what, the late 1980s, as a reaction to the occupation of Palestine. And then the Houthis, they have deep roots in their country. I mean, there's 80 Shias, in the area of Yemen that they're from was ruled by Shia imams for 1,000 years before the 1960s, and then their kind of form of Islam was suppressed by the Saudi-backed government and things, and and the spread of Salafi, Wahhabism and things. So they were formed as like a reaction to that and getting back to their own roots. So yeah, all these groups are a product of where they came from, and yet it's not like global jihad, but it
Right,
has
because
very much.
Hamas was a break off of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? If I'm
Yeah,
remembering
yeah,
my history right,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they're, yeah, pretty much. But now it's become, this current situation. They call themselves the axis of resistance. The Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis, the Shiite um, militias in Iraq. It's very much become a regional war, and that's why we see the Houthis shutting down the Red Sea in response to what's happening in Gaza. And their probably ultimate goal is getting the U.S. out, and that's what the IRGC. They're always more hardline than the Iranian civilian leadership. They're saying that that's their terms for ending the war right now, is getting the U.S. is a retreat from the region, from the U.S. Um, but yeah, that's what is this has become now.
Right, which again, these are not you can disagree with the means of a group of people while also, I think, acknowledging that the fundamental orientation or outrage is justified or at least understandable. Like, I mean, heck, our own country thinks that we should have a Monroe Doctrine and that we should not only control what happens on our borders, but that we should control what happens in our hemisphere. And that was kind of half the justification for why we took out Maduro in Venezuela. Um, but it's like we have this consistent foreign policy double standard where it's like, well, we wouldn't put up with a another country's military force being in our hemisphere, mucking about and doing things that are against our interest. We wouldn't put up with, the example of like Russia and Ukraine, we wouldn't put up with China building a bunch of missile launchers in Mexico or in Canada or in Cuba or something like that, that were dual purpose and aimed at America. And yeah, like if you have a country that's receiving billions of dollars in foreign aid from America and military assistance to continue what is essentially like an apartheid situation with the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, uh, then you're going to get predictable resistance to that and predictable blowback to that. And it does seem like there's people who just aren't willing to sort of dive into these fundamental, heck, even the fundamental grievances of the Bin Laden night, um, Muslims that we were fighting that did 9/11. That wasn't even born in a vacuum. I mean, it's not like the fundamental, and I guess this is where we can touch a little bit, maybe, at the
I
end
got to
here.
I got to take off because I still got a lot of work to do this evening. So
Right. Um, but I mean, I guess my closing question to you would be you know, do you I think we would agree that the fundamental driving force of why a lot of these people are driven towards this radicalism is because of the American and Israeli actions and just kind of like continuing down this road is just guaranteeing we're going to continue to get more of that.
Yeah, I mean, especially with, as I said earlier, like how this war started. I mean, with the elementary school bombing and killing the leader and his whole family and his son taking over. I mean, yeah, it's just a recipe for more, for more. And even Trump, like in some comments, he said something like, "Oh, I guess it's possible that we could do all this, and then someone worse takes over." So he seems to be aware of this possibility. Um, so the question is he going to cut and run, or is he going to double down? And it's looking like he's going to double down and escalate and just create more of this chaos in the region.
Yep, absolutely. Dave, thanks for being here. Remind everyone again where they can follow you, antiwar.com, or where they can find your show.
Go to antiwar.com. You'll see all my writing, mostly in the news section at the top of the page there. And my show is called Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp, and follow me on X at DeCamp Dave.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave, for being here. Always a pleasure to chat and catch up. Thanks, everyone, for being here and listening. Make sure you like this video, subscribe. I will be back live again here Thursday night, again at 6 o'clock, and then be back again next Monday as well. And yeah, everyone, just keep paying attention. Make sure you subscribe to Dave, follow antiwar.com, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.